everyone, this is Kara, and welcome back to Cultures for Health podcast. If you missed the last episode, we welcomed Food 52's resident baker Maurizio. Go back and learn about his newest recipe, dark chocolate cherry sourdough. If you're interested in making your very own sourdough at home, Cultures for Health has everything you need to get started. Use the code CFH Podcast to get 25% off. All right, let's get into some more sourdough talk with Maurizio. Do you have a favorite flour brand? I know you mentioned King Arthur, that you do a little bit of work with King Arthur. I think I saw Anson Mills tagged in your post at one point too. They have a lot of really good specialty types flours. So do you have a favorite flour brand, type, protein content? Is there anything such as bad flour? Like, can you get a batch of flour and it just not be good? You know, when you're looking into flours and what's best for your bake, what do you look for? What do you like? Where do you find it?
Yeah. I think it comes down to a kind of a personal preference. There's obviously organic versus not organic. There's local milled. You can buy flour online from anywhere these days. So, for me, I get a lot of my flour from Central Milling because they're somewhat nearby where I live in the Southwest. And I source flour from Hayden Flour Mills in Arizona and Barton Springs in Texas, I live in New Mexico, so they're, around my area. I've got flour from Cairn Springs up in the Pacific Northwest, which is great. And, King Arthur and Bob's, and those are two, like you said, stable, like consistent flour sources that are always reliable. Anson Mills they're for a home baker, Anson Mills is more of like a specialty kind of order, small batch flour, but they have, incredible flour for different baking applications. And then I also mill a good portion of my own flour here. I've got a couple mills that I use. And I think, a pretty large percentage of my baking is freshly milled flour. So I do that side. And there is such a thing as bad flour. I mean, I think it's less common these days given, milling standards and the knowledge out there. I'm not an expert on milling, by any means, but I've had flour in the past where I just, couldn't make a successful loaf of bread, and it could have been for various, specifications, on the flour, the falling number, or the ash content, or, it's a very complex topic that I think most of us home bakers at least can kind of be confident that the millers that we're buying from are doing a good job at testing and making sure that their flour is bakeable. And so I think we're super lucky in that regard. But those are my favorite sources. And like I said at the beginning, I order 50-pound bags at this point, and from Central Milling usually, and they're my go-to source for flour.
So do you find that you always stick to AP flour or bread flour or a mix, or kind of just diversify, do some grains, add in there? Do you think that, do you really hone in on protein content in your flours, or are you just more looking for, a good solid product? What is your level of attention to detail there? And do you think that it's critical? Like I see in places AP flour and I see in places bread flour, and it kind of seems to be this like almost internal struggle in the bread baking community of which one is better. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question because there's a lot of confusion, I think, between and for good reason, because there's no really good specification for flour here in the United States that kind of answers all questions for flour. Like, in Europe or in other parts of the world, there's better flour naming systems, so more precisely what you're getting. So, here in the US, a lot of bakers will refer to, like you said, all-purpose flour or bread flour. But some bakers refer to bread flour as any flour that's used for bread making. And so, it's confusing. So on my website, I always
Right.
specify the protein percentage, and also I usually say what flour I'm using to kind of give people an idea. And personally, for my baking, I prefer to use as much lower protein flour as possible. And I don't mean low as in like, 10% protein, like, cake or pastry flour. I mean like
Right.
11 to 12% range. So usually what you would find for an all-purpose.
Or a
And the
very
reason is
low
I,
bread. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And the reason I like that protein percentage is because I find the resulting bread to be texturally more appealing to me. It's more tender
Hmm.
and less chewy and less gummy usually. Um, I think bread flour is okay. When I say bread flour, I mean higher protein, like high 12 to 13, sometimes even 14%. Um, I use that flour sparingly and only when I find that the recipe needs, added structure, or I've got a lot of inclusions going in, or a lot of enrichments, fat or sugar going in there. Um,
Right.
and so, yeah, so for my baking, especially for my freeform hearth loaves, it's usually around 11 to 12% for tenderness. I mean, using that level of protein, you're not going to get loaves that are, huge oven spring with like a super open, holy interior. It's going to be more reserved, right? You're going to be more closed off. But I think I think the focus should be, aesthetics are obviously important for sure, um, but I think the focus should be texture and taste and kind of mouthfeel and those things. So that's why I usually go for that style of flour.
That's very interesting. That's good to know. We don't ask people that a lot, but I think I'm going to start asking that more because I think people don't really put enough attention into the flour that they're using. Even every piece of this you could put. I feel like infinite
Yeah,
attention into it.
true.
And still be learning. But I think one thing people don't think enough about is where they're getting their flour from. I mean, I've gotten flour I don't have flour mills. I don't have any of that kind of stuff. And so I got flour once that was 4 days old, fresh milled. And that
Yeah,
was, incredible. And I got it from the company themselves. It was Lindley Mills, which is a local North South Carolina mill
yeah,
company. But it works so different.
it does.
Your
Yeah,
hydration changes a lot with something that's so fresh, and you learn a lot about what you want and what you bake based on kind of the flour that you're looking for. And like you said, it should be about taste and it should be about texture. And just because it's like the biggest, most holy loaf doesn't mean it's necessarily the best one. And I think that's sometimes where like Instagram fails us is we see all these beautiful pictures and we're like, wow, like my loaf doesn't have a hole that's as big as that loaf, but that doesn't
right.
necessarily mean that you're wrong or you did it bad or that it's not good to you. It's all about figuring out what works best for you and
Hmm.
using, if you can find local flour, using that local flour. If Bob's Red Mill or King Arthur are your best options, then those are your best options. But understanding that for yourselves and working that out for yourself, I think is important to in your sourdough journey, especially when we have flour shortages like we did at the beginning of COVID.
Right.
And
Yeah,
you're, you know,
I think I think baking, if you're a home baker, even if you own a bakery, it's going to be a personal thing for you. Like, what are you baking for? Like, if you're baking for, only for nutrition, then it's going to be 100% whole wheat bread, and you're going to have, a denser loaf than you are if you have 100% white flour loaf of bread, and that's okay. Like, your bread doesn't have to be, massively open and light. If that's your style that you're going for, that's cool. Do what makes it satisfying for you. I think for me, I have at this point, if I don't have like at least 20% whole grains in the recipe, it tastes flat to me. It doesn't have that depth of flavor that I want. And
mhm.
I don't know if that's an evolving change to my palate or, I don't know what it is, but that's where I'm at, and I want the bread to be as flavorful and tender as possible. And so all of my my sourdough starter maintenance goes towards that direction. My flour choices kind of go towards that direction. My hydration goes there. And so yeah, you just have to look at what is most appealing to you, and source your flour and all the other inputs that go to it accordingly.
So going into that with milling your own flours sometimes and getting that experience to kind of almost find grains that you wouldn't normally find, you get to buy the whole grain and you get to mill it yourself. Do you find yourself doing that a lot? Do you find yourself purchasing small batches of, some weird grain like spelt or, rye is not that crazy, but rye is pretty foreign to a lot of us. Do you find yourself seeking out alternative grains, milling them yourselves? Where do you find those grains? What do you look for? How do you usually add it in? Do you usually mill it? Do you try to do like whole grain soaks? Kind of what's your thought about alternative grain styles? Because like you were saying, like that's a lot of where we get nutrition sometimes. And I think people are really looking towards those things. And, as people look to forage naturally and find the things that exist in the world around them, they're looking outside the box to find alternative flours. What is your
Right.
thoughts around all of that and kind of embracing more of what's local to you? The everyday AP flour may not be a wheat that's local to you, but maybe you get, I don't know, like a dark rye berry local to
Mhm.
you. What's your thought process, word of advice? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think there's an endless kind of playground for exploration there with grains and varieties, and especially nowadays because you're getting um, consumers are having access to grain varieties that it's hard to keep up sometimes. There's millers are coming up with new. I mean, it's all coming from the farmers, of course, who are probably exploring grain that grows better in their climate, or marketing or whatever it is. But for us as bakers, we're lucky because we get to try these things. It's like a chef having a
Mhm.
completely new ingredient coming to the table,
Right.
or to the kitchen. Um, and I think for me, I do exactly what you said. I buy little, 2 or 5 pound bags of this grain or that grain. I'll mill it, I'll try it, and I'll see how I like the flavor and the dough consistency and how it changes the texture. Um, and spelt is hands down my favorite of any of the grain, honestly, even over like a modern wheat. Um, and so I use that constantly in my baking. I mill often, at least every bake or maybe every other bake. I'll mix in some freshly milled flour. If it's a recipe that I'm developing for, like Food 52 or King Arthur or my website, I might not, because I'm trying to get recipes for all levels of baker or all interests. But my personal baking here at home is, a lot of whole grains, a lot of freshly milled spelt, specifically. And I think, if you're interested in going down the freshly milled route, I think you should wait until you've baked enough bread that you're confident with the process and you've kind of got a feel built up for the dough. That way, when you start milling fresh flour, like you said, it's a different ball game. Like the dough will feel differently. The
Mhm.
hydrations you need
Right.
adjusting, and so don't go down that path. Don't be too eager to go down that path too fast until you're kind of confident you're baking with aged flour that you buy at the market or a local miller. I think that'll help you, because I feel like a lot of people, they kind of dive into fresh milling right away, and it can be challenging in the beginning because the dough isn't going to be as elastic, as strong as it will be with something you buy that's been aged. And so it requires some adjustment, and I'm not saying that to scare people away, because I think it's one of the most exciting things you can do if you're a baker at home. But I would wait a little bit until you get some experience there. Um, yeah.
Good to know. Do you have a favorite grain? You mentioned spelt. Is that your favorite added?
Yeah, yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah.
There's just for me, there's something about the flavor of it. It's like, this, I mean, it's unmistakable when you have bread that has some in there. And I always work some in kind of my weekly loaf because it just adds this like amazing aroma and this kind of like nutty flavor that you don't even need to add any mix-ins. It's like its own category of ingredients. So I love spelt. I also freshly mill. I've done like Khorasan before, which is I think great too. Rye, freshly milled rye is amazing. I mean, I've milled I've milled it all. I feel like maybe not every variety because there's so many different varieties of
Right.
wheat now.
Gosh.
I
Yeah.
know it's crazy, but
It's
I also
wild.
it is. I also really love Sonora wheat. So it's a
Mhm.
lower protein kind of white wheat, and that has a great flavor, especially for things like tortillas or other flatbreads that you might make. Yeah, I mean, it's endless. You could go in any direction there.
Yeah, I'm looking up Sonora flour now because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's like this really creamy, like yellowish hue to it, and
Mhm.
um, yeah, it's an amazing flavor.
Gonna try that. Awesome. Oh, it says it's a type well tolerated by people with celiacs and meat allergies. Interesting. Okay, well, not to stray too far away because I could I could go down the
Right.
flour rabbit hole for forever. So let's take a step back and let's talk about your starter for a second. So I know that it sounded like you said you bake about once a week, and then you kind of have more bakes throughout the week. It sounds like maybe one large bake with a few more scattered in. Is that true? Tell us about your sourdough starter process, how you ramp up, how you bring it back down. Do you have any discard? What do you do with that discard? Do you do a lot of discard recipes? All of that kind of good stuff. Tell us
Yeah.
all the 101.
All right. Yeah, so I actually bake every day. So I usually bake in some capacity, maybe not a large 4 to 6 loaf. I mean, that's large for me, 4 to 6 loaf bake.
Mm-hmm.
But since I'm, constantly baking, not only for my family to eat, but for recipes, my starter is, it's very spoiled at this point. I mean, I just keep it at high activity, as high
Mm-hmm.
fermentation activity as I can. Um, and so I feed or refresh it probably more than I think what a typical home baker might need to if they're looking to just kind of bake as a hobby or casually. I usually refresh it once in the morning and then once at night, so twice a day. Um, and I give it 100 grams of flour and about 100 grams of water. And then I usually, depending on the season, I'll leave between 5 and I don't know 20 grams of starter in the jar each day or each refreshment interval. And then for the flour, I'm always kind of changing the flour mix because I'm always testing something. But usually it's about 30% whole grain rye and then 30% like medium protein white flour, so like an all-purpose flour. And so that's kind of my go-to maintenance for my starter. And I keep it warm, so I keep it. If my kitchen's not warm, like right now, it's frigidly cold here. I'll keep it
Mm-hmm.
in like a little proofing box, usually around 67 or I would say 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in
Mm-hmm.
that range to keep it kind of um, strong and active.
So do you have a lot of discard and waste, or is it really going into your everyday bakes?
A lot of it goes into the just the next bake that I'm doing, whether I'm making another
Mm-hmm.
levain to go, for that day or the day, overnight. For discards, yeah, I use my discards constantly too. So I do, crackers, pancakes, and waffles are like a weekend ritual. Um, I do a lot of like muffins. I mean, you can pretty much work that discard into any baked good that you're doing. Um, and I'd say for me, it's almost always going to be on the weekend when I do pancakes and waffles. I'll do like large batches because my kids will just eat
Eat them
through
up.
those so fast through the week.
Right. Mhm.
So I do that. And then, if I'm making a pie, I have a recipe on my website for a discard pie crust. I'll put the discard in the pie crust. Um, and yeah, I mean, you can work it in anywhere. It just brings added flavor and a little bit of nutrition too. So yeah.
So that's good to hear. We always like to hear that people are using their discards and not just trashing them. Or
Right.
compost is better, but compost can get wonky sometimes depending on where you're at and what your compost is doing. So I think that's really cool to hear people talk about what they can put their discard in. I saw a muffin on your website that looked really good that had some discard in it. I think
Yep.
biscuits is another one too that is great for discard. Pasta, I think I also saw on your website. Not sure if you had that with discard in it, but that goes back to Italian roots. My family is also Italian, so every year we
Oh,
make
cool.
ravioli on Christmas. But I would love to convince my family to make a sourdough ravioli one year. That would be really
That'd be
exciting.
awesome. Yeah.
Not sure they're quite there yet. They're pretty stuck in their tradition, but
I was gonna say, I think
when it's my
if I told
generation's turn.
right, if I told my dad that, he'd probably be like, I don't think we're gonna be doing that.
Yeah, like a sourdough pizza crust. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
all
Well,
of that good
he's
stuff
so
is
he's okay with the pizza crust because I make
oh,
pizza.
awesome. Perfect.
Yeah, I make pizza often here, and he likes it. He thinks it's great, and he's a chef. So when he used
Mhm.
to live back in Italy, back when he was making pizza, at least the way he tells me, they used all sourdough, everything. They would just
Oh,
hold a piece of the
cool.
dough
Mhm.
overnight and use it in the
Yeah.
next batch. So
Awesome.
he's exposed to it, but at his restaurant, he never did sourdough. It was kind of the New York style pizza place, and so they just kind of use commercial yeast, but it was still good. Still good pizza.
Oh yeah, all yeast raised products are good.
Yeah,
If it's
I
got
agree.
sourdough or if it's commercial yeast, I don't discriminate in bread. Bread is bread in my
That's right.
opinion. It's
That's
all a
right.
little bit of fermentation. I know commercial yeast is a much faster fermentation, but in my mind it's all fermentation. It's all got its
Yeah,
place
it's
for
all good.
sure. Yeah, all delicious. So, with some of the loaves that you make, I saw you utilize them in some different ways, some of which I've done myself, like French toast. Some of which, like, I think I saw you make a loaf pan loaf and you made little, like, pizza squares out of it, which was really
Hmm.
cute, but also, like, a great idea for your kids, great
Yeah.
idea for the family, quick, easy snack. Do you have more of those ideas that you could share with us? Do you find yourself doing that a lot where you're doing bakes daily or you have a big bake on the weekend and you've got these loaves left over and you don't know what to do with them? How do you share your loaves? If you're baking that often, how do you share your loaves? But then also, how do you find ways to kind of use those loaves differently
Hmm.
and get your kids involved in getting good snacks?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question because when you are trying to bake at home, it's hard because you need to bake a lot, right, to get better.
Mhm.
And so, what do you do with this
Mhm.
leftover bread? If you're baking too
Right.
much, then you can eat. Um, yeah, we find a way to use all the bread in some way here that I bake. So my kind of go-to uses are definitely French toast on the weekend, and you can freeze,
Solid.
make the French toast and then freeze those that you don't eat, and during the week you can just reheat
Mhm.
them up in the toaster. I mean, it's perfect. Um, and then the next thing for me would be like breadcrumbs and croutons. So I do
Oh,
that
yeah, for sure.
constantly. Once your loaf gets to like, if it's sourdough, it gets to a week and it's getting stale, then, cube it
Right.
up and olive oil and salt and pepper and bake it. And you got croutons right
Oh,
there.
yeah.
So use it. It's great.
Delicious.
And they're delicious. Yep. Um, let's see. You can do things like bow stock, like, if you're making like a brioche loaf, it's kind of like a baked dessert in a way. So there's a whole like slew of French and even Italian desserts that are made from bread that have been left over. Even American style, things like
Mhm.
bread pudding or custard with bread pieces in it. I mean,
Right.
any of those things are fun to experiment with. Um, And then, in the last resort, you can always just freeze the bread itself. So I'll wait till it cools like overnight, slice the entire loaf, and then freeze it as slices. And then you can just toast each slice during the week. And it comes out, like as if you were to bake it almost fresh. So I do that. Yeah. So, usually what I'll do is I'll give extra loaves. I'll put them in a paper bag and kind of seal the bag, give them to my wife. She'll bring them to work and leave them there, or give them to coworkers. And, the only thing I ask back in return, I guess, is that, I love their feedback, because I'm always trying to make my bread a little better, whether it's the flavor or the texture. So, not having a bakery, it's sometimes hard to get feedback on what you're baking. So that it's actually kind of a valuable way for me to kind of learn about what people like and don't like. And, in terms of, you had asked about, how do you share or give it away? And I mean, that's what I do, is I just put it in a paper bag, which I think is, kind of the best way to keep the bread fresh for a long time. It's just stored in a sealed bag.
Definitely. I do the same thing with my kombucha around our office. I make some kombucha and I bring it in bottled, and I say, this is for free as long as you bring back your bottle and a couple words of what you thought about it.
Yeah.
And it creates a great way for you to do your recipe development, but then also to me, it brings in that sense of community too, of like bringing other people kind of into that fermentation world who wouldn't necessarily like see themselves into sourdough or see themselves into kombucha. And it starts that conversation. Maybe it starts that thought process in their head of maybe, oh, hey, I should eat some more fermented foods. So like even just, sharing what you have too much of, I feel like it's an important part of people who have been in the industry for a long time, sharing their knowledge with other people. Because I think once you've been doing it for so long, you want to be a part of that community, and you want to teach, and you want to learn, and you want to share. And I think sharing and giving away your product and getting feedback is a great way to involve people in the community and get them interested and get them started.
Yeah. I agree. And I think the other important thing there is that when people taste, kombucha or sourdough bread, and they have something that tastes that good, but is still that much more healthy for you. I think it's, if they've never had that, I think it's kind of a revelation. It's like, oh, I remember having bread like this when I was a kid, or, I've never had bread taste this way. What are you putting in it? And then I tell them, oh, it just has, 4 ingredients. And they're like, wait a minute.
Wow.
You know what I mean? So
yeah,
like you said, it's an educational thing also. And I think it helps people realize that they can make these things for themselves, and it can be, amazing, like better bread than you've probably had in a long time.
For sure. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and talking to us today. Your Instagram is absolutely beautiful. You've got tons of things going on, which is what I love. You've got all kinds of recipes, all kinds of ways to use your loaf. And it really seems like you're inspiring a lot of people to take on the challenge of baking sourdough. If you could leave us with one piece of advice to someone looking to start their sourdough journey, what would it be?
There's so many pieces of advice. I think the first thing
It's
I would
hard.
say, it's hard. I always like to say that great bread kind of starts with, strong fermentation. So it's always, for me, it's kind of like the focus on your starter, maintaining it properly, making sure that it is doing what you need it to do when you need it to do it. I think if you start there, then you're on a good path forward.
I could not agree more. Thank you so much, Maurizio, for taking the time to talk to us and giving us a little bit of your bread baking knowledge. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Make sure you go say hi to Maurizio on his Instagram and his website, The Perfect Loaf. If you're interested in making your very own sourdough at home, Cultures for Health has everything you need to get started. Use the code CFH Podcast to get 25% off. Subscribe to our podcast to stay in the loop with all things fermented and cultured foods. See you next time.